"You stole the design, Michael," Randy Whitaker bellowed, and the words hit me like a fist that found my low ribs. The banquet hall going thin with the sound, forks stopping midair, laughter folding into a cold silence. And my daughter Emily, my Emily, sat 3 tables over with her school jacket still on and a paper cup of punch clutched in both hands. Eyes wide and the color draining from her face, so fast I felt it, as if my blood had been siphoned out. "My name is Michael Reed. I'm 42 from Cleveland, Ohio." I said that one thing into the room like a quiet before a storm. And somewhere beneath the business shirts and the string lights I could feel a cheap blue receipt, Joe's Diner. 7:23 a.m. crumpled in my back pocket, the napkin with my scrawl of the core idea folded into it like a talisman. I had one small thing nobody at that table knew about, something that remembered dates and words better than people did. And I felt it there, against the leather like a pulse. People looked. Someone coughed like a judge clearing room. Randy's laugh was a blade with a smile on it. Sarah Mills, at his elbow, let a camera-like phone rise and tilt toward me with the casual cruelty of the practiced. A video started somewhere, a tiny red light blinking to life, and I heard the whisper that tells you the world is already reshaping itself around what was said. I wanted to stomp the floor, to shove the microphone back at him, to tell Emily this was a lie and that she should stand with me, but pride made my hands heavy and my voice small, and I watched Randy take my work and flick it into the air like an empty beer can, and every head turned to the sound. He called me a fraud. The HR director, Marta Lewis, sat with her palm over her mouth because the rules said she should remain neutral. The room smelled of cheap coffee, perfume, and the citrus of the valet's cologne who had once held the door for me when I thought promotion would happen tomorrow. The banquet lights became interrogation lamps. "You promised us the pitch was ready," Randy said, like he was reading aloud my sentence of death. "You told the board you authored the prototype." The truth in his sentence didn't matter. A truth dressed like a headline is harder to unmake. My chest filled with a heat that had nothing to do with the room. I thought of the dent in the dashboard of my old pickup, of Emily's science fair pictures taped to the fridge, of the blue matchstick of a neon sign over Joe's Diner where I had scribbled the first diagram on a napkin after a night shift, and every memory made my hands clench around the invisible drive in my mind. Pride is a brittle mirror. It always cuts the hand that checks it. I said nothing at first because saying something would become a soundbite, and soundbites were Randy's province. He had learned the economy of accusation. Instead, I held my daughter's eye across the room, and in that second between gasps and the camera's click, I decided what not to do: sweep, plead, list achievements, make it about legacy. I would not be theatrical. I would not give Randy the theater he wanted. Behind his smile, I saw the breadcrumb lines of emails he had left wide as a road. I saw Sarah's phone lift like a judge's gavel, and I felt the quiet weight of that Joe's Diner receipt, as if it were a small Bible in my pocket. They escorted me out like a man who might return with a lawyer or might slink away. My daughter's teacher came to me later that night with a look that asked if I was okay, if she should procure a counselor. The bystanders used the word shock like a blanket to cover their gossip. They meant something else. They meant this was entertainment. I went out the back door and the cold knocked against my face, and I heard the distant swell of people discussing whether I was finished or merely a cautionary tale. The security guard, Tom Bennett, looked at me like he had to make a choice between being kind and being correct. He opened the door and let me pass, and I thanked him by name because names in small towns are the way you pay someone for their humanity. I walked to my truck past a row of headlights, past a late-night deli open and humming with its owner's radio, and when I lowered myself into the cab, I took the Joe's Diner receipt from my pocket and smoothed the napkin out with my thumb until the ink shone. That napkin had the first sketch of the interface and the 3 little notes with the words sync, offline, timestamp, that had stopped being a joke between me and a friend, and had become the backbone of the prototype everyone now claimed as a team's triumph. I thought of Emily asleep in the passenger seat of my mind, The way she always lips the spoon of cereal before deciding if her mouth will commit to the taste. And I felt something thin and precise move inside me, anger. Yes, but colder than anger, a shape of logistics. I would prove authorship not by crying to a crowd but by making incontrovertible evidence speak. I drove home without headlights for a while because the dark let me think in close, like a man reading the fine print of his own skin. I set the receipt on my kitchen table between a chipped World's Best Dad mug, symbolic, stupid, comforting, and the pile of printouts HR had emailed me as if offense could be papered over. I did not cry. I washed the coffee mug and dried it in a way that feels like a ritual. Somewhere in the night, a video of Randy's accusation found its way online, gaining the cheap combustibility of viral content. 30-second cuts, captions, the way the world now trades in your reputation as if it were a stock shorted and then set aflame. I watched it once, not for the humiliation but for the seams. You learn to read a cut as you learn to read a person's lie, the small hesitation and a smile, the tilt of the camera toward someone's reaction, the way a crowd's laughter contains an undertone of hunger. I opened an old hard drive, the one I kept under the breadboard in the closet because it was the kind of place nobody would look, and I ran a finger along the case like a man feeling for a pulse. That pulse was the repository of a year of drafts. String of emails, commit logs, the night-by-night versions of a thing I had made in the small hours when the house was quiet and the world owed me nothing. I promised Emily under my breath that I would make this right. The next morning, Marta called me in for a meeting dressed in a gray suit that made her look like a cloud, and she asked me the ritual questions. Did I know who leaked the file? Did I have witnesses? Did I have anything that could explain the timestamps? I said that I did, but I would not give it to her like a beggar. I would assemble it and present it like a man who knew the value of his life's work. The climb would be narrow. I knew the slats. The corporate engine chews and spits men like me with the same mechanical indifference, but stubbornness can be an engine too slow, grinding, determined. I began to map the world of our company not in promotions and badges, but in documents and small betrayals, the overlooked threads that hold a lie together. People always leave a trail if you look at data the way an owl looks at the meadow. There are receipts, there are edits, there are chat logs people forget to delete, and there are small rules written into contracts that lie like tripwires for the arrogant. I thought of the napkin at Joe's diner and how trivial it had seemed the night I drew it, a little caffeine-induced geometry, and how it had become a talisman that could either vindicate me or become my last lunch. Somewhere in my desk, a USB lived, a cold answer to every question. In my wallet, a memory. In my closet, a drive and a shoebox. And I began the quiet work of inventory indexing files, printing logs, extracting deposits of proof like a prospector finds flecks of gold. I reached out to Javier Morales, who had been my teammate once, who still owed me a favor since he had introduced me to the client who had given the company its first break. Javier met me in a bar where the dartboard had lost its numbers and told me the truth straight. People will believe the loudest voice. We have to be louder with facts. So we started getting louder not with shouting but with method. Timestamp comparisons, metadata checks, the tedious kind of work that moves like honey slow but irresistible. We mapped the commit history against the payroll times, found nights when I had pushed code while Randy was at his yacht club, nights when Sarah had texted contempt like a mosquito bite in the dark. We assembled everything with surgical patience, because if I did this, it would have to be undeniable. Indignation without proof is just noise. The second week of the scandal, a screenshot of a private chat between Sarah and Randy surfaced on a gossip site. It showed Sarah laughing about how easy it was to shift the credit. That screenshot made the rounds and people took sides for a week like changeable weather. The company lawyer Vanessa Clark sent emails with thick legal anchors, and HR began to act like ships that have changed course. The pain of Emily's shame was a constant thermal in my chest. She came to sleep at my house for a few nights, and we made grilled cheese and watched hockey, not to keep things ordinary, but to prove that ordinary could still exist after a stain. I taught her how to boil eggs without fear, and she taught me how to make the smallest moments look like surrender, which is to say that she taught me to accept kindness when it came. I did not tell her everything. I could not. Secrets are their own fuel. The online conversation swung. One day I was a cautionary tale, the next a martyr for workplace fairness, and through it all I kept my breath measured and my fingers busy cataloging files. I found a minor inconsistency in the internal IP agreement, a clause nobody read that required a document signed by the inventor to transfer rights. A tiny formal detail that Randy had never secured because he did not think he needed to. He assumed that power was sufficiently persuasive to erase paperwork. That tiny line was like an unlit fuse. I kept working, aligning the napkin's ink to the metadata of files, scanning it at the highest resolution, watermarking copies, sealing them in dated envelopes, as if I were preparing exhibits for a trial I intended to win. The cameras returned. A live opinion host called me a middle management martyr, and then asked whether I would reveal the receipts live. I said no, because there is a moment for spectacle and a moment for law, and I would not confuse the two. I learned the way the world now measures justice views, retweets, the tiny metric that sometimes becomes legislation, and I began to plan not a public tantrum but a precise collapse. A leak, a recording, a legal technicality that would not just humiliate Randy the way he humiliated me, but would make him break the shape of his own story. The room for error was tiny. I tightened everything like a man wrenching an engine, and in that tightening I felt the shape of my ancestors' hands, working in factories where men like them learned that the only thing you can be sure of is the rhythm of the machine. I moved through days like a man welding pieces of evidence, soldering them together with counsel from Vanessa, and the quiet help of Javier, who knew enough about servers to track a login. We watched logs and waited for Randy to step on a nail of his own making. Arrogance is a predictable animal. We baited him with small lies, like leaving a draft where he could find it, and he took it like the fox in a trap. Then, at the point when the trap should snap, before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I placed that absurdness like a coin on a table and pushed it off, because even in real life the theater of modern attention can be as useful as law, and people love to feel like witnesses. The click of the upload was not dramatic in itself. It was the accumulated sound of months of meticulous work. We set the post to go live when Randy would be on stage, receiving an industry award, so everyone could see the contrast between his smile and the proof of his petty theft. The night before the release, I slept in my truck and woke with my forehead pressed to the steering wheel, feeling both enormous weariness and a clean clarity. I would not allow myself to imagine victory. Imagining is a hunger that can lead you to careless mistakes. I rehearsed the small things, how I would present the napkin photograph, the scanned log files, the metadata hashes, the email trails aligned like train cars, and I plotted the procedural wedge we would use, a clause in the company's IP assignment that required explicit written waiver to move an inventor's rights, and patterns of server authentication that would show who pushed what and when. We had to expose not only that he stole, but the method. A forgery he had made with his own hubris, and an oversight that mattered because the law sometimes rests on a comma. I felt every hinge in the plan creak, and then hold. The world is made of these small mechanics if you look. I trained Emily on a simple thing, how to hold her chin up if she needed, how to be present without performing, because she was the only one left I needed to make proud before the sun rose on the next day's events, and I wanted her to understand that dignity is a muscle you exercise with small, stubborn choices. The day we chose to pull the thread, the world seemed ordinary in a way that made me nervous. A neighbor mowing a lawn, a dog sprinting an invisible route, a kid on a bicycle who did not know that a man's life would be remade that afternoon. I went in thinking of the napkin, of the chipped mug, of the blue receipt, and of the temperature of iron in my hands, as if everything could be fixed by evidence alone. The trap was set. The bait was loaded. The plan had a hinge that I believed would catch and hold Randy Whitaker's arrogance long enough for the law to take its small, inevitable bite. The next move would be the one that defined us both, and there was no turning back. I stepped into the elevator with Javier and Vanessa at my sides, and as the doors closed I felt the room tighten like the throat of a man about to speak the single most important sentence of his life. The elevator chimed and the doors expelled us into a corridor that smelled like new carpet and old power, and I felt the heavy click of my heart align with the mechanical hum of fluorescent lights as Vanessa led us toward the boardroom where Randy would be waiting with a smile that had already eaten his conscience. Javier walked 2 steps behind like a man carrying a fuse, his phone a flat stone in his palm, and I kept my hands empty because hands with papers tremble and I needed my hands to be the hands of a tradesman, steady, useful. The boardroom doors opened onto a long table where men and women circled like planets around Randy's orbit. He rose when we entered as if the room was his theater and he had been practicing the bow. He extended a hand, varnished with charm, and I took it because to refuse would be a performance, and I decided that every performance would now be aimed at one exact thing, the exposed hinge that would make his stage catch fire. Randy's laugh was the practiced thing of a man who thinks volume can drown evidence. Sarah sat near him with the half-smile of someone who knows the angle of a photograph. They had already started the small business of undermining me in whispers that smelled like old wine. Vanessa asked for order like a judge. She moved with the calm of someone who had read the script enough times to see where the improv would fail. "We'll walk through the documents," she said simply, and that sentence dropped a net into the water that made everyone look down. I opened my laptop and the slide of evidence unfurled high-resolution scans, hashes, commit logs, email threads threaded like a beadwork of timestamps, and the room inhaled. I wanted to watch Randy's face as the world narrowed to facts. For a moment his eyes flicked to Emily's school jacket folded on a chair at the end of the table. My mouth tightened because that look was where my fear lived. That immediate worry that something small and bright, belonging to my daughter, might be crushed in the machinery of this fight. Vanessa started with a map of server authentication. Times, IP addresses, author hashes, the little stubborn things that lying men forget to scrub. Javier projected a screen and the logs unrolled like a ticker tape, showing pushes and commits that aligned with the nights I worked while Randy was at parties documented in social feeds. The back-end timestamps matched the hand-scribbled napkin I had scanned, the napkin that smelled faintly of diner grease and hope. Someone cleared their throat, someone's phone buzzed. The world outside the glass wall was busy and unknowing. Randy's smile narrowed. He started to speak, but Vanessa anticipated him with the legal weight of a document that made words small. The IP assignment clause, highlighted, called out, the clause that required a signed inventor's acknowledgement to transfer rights. Randy's name did not appear on the inventor's signature line. His eyes sought the clause and found it like a rat in a trap finds the bar. "You'll forgive me," Randy said too quickly. We assumed standard practice applied. His assumption sounded like a confession when Vanessa read the precise language. People shifted. A board member named Collins, an older man who had the habit of tapping a fountain pen like a metronome, asked whether internal procedure had been followed. Vanessa's reply was a simple set of instructions. "We must refer this to counsel. We must freeze whatever claims have been assigned, and we must audit the submission pipeline." That language is not dramatic on the surface, but in the world of corporate machinery, it turns hands that thought themselves steady into hands that must account for receipts. I felt the old napkin there on the table in my memory. Its coffee ring moon and the knowledge that procedural justice moves slowly, but it moves with a strange mechanical fairness. It requires the proper signatures, the correct boxes checked, the small literalities that arrogant men dismiss, because arrogance values spin over form. Javier's fingers moved fast. He pulled up a cached copy of a presentation Randy had posted to a private vendor, and it contained metadata that contradicted Randy's timeline. He scrolled, and I watched color drain from faces like paint because the internet keeps the footprints you think you wiped. Someone in the room took a picture with a phone, and the small click sounded like a verdict. Before I could breathe, Sarah stood and denounced the logs as manipulated. She accused Javier of planting evidence, her voice sharp like a scalpel, and the room swelled with a sudden current of doubt. The dip in my chest was immediate and reflexive. A quick lie can sometimes suture a wound faster than an honest explanation. I watched Vanessa's jaw set. She offered to have a neutral third party verify the metadata, and the slow work of establishing impartiality began. Outside, the rumor mill had already chewed and spat. Within an hour a second, more edited clip of Randy's earlier accusation appeared on a trade forum with a caption that suggested corporate infighting and a man unfit for leadership. Social media reacted in its familiar cascade: outrage, defense, memes, then a hollow kind of sympathy for any side that looked like the underdog. I felt whiplash. One moment the law's logic steadied the room. The next our fight was being reduced to a string of comments and a trending hashtag. The emotional seesaw is a device beyond my control. Every time we cleared a legal hurdle, someone online knocked it down with a meme. Mid-afternoon, the company's PR director, Thin, anxious, came into the boardroom with a phone that showed the front page of a business newsletter. Whose work is it? Internal drama erupts at Whitaker Tech. The headline's font made guilt look like a brand. Emily walked into the building clutching her backpack like a shield. She had insisted on coming because she wanted to see if her father was going to be a coward or a man. The sight of her in the doorway stopped me like a physical hand. She had always been small in my peripheral vision, and suddenly she was impossibly large. I kept my face steady, and she sat beside me, legs swinging, and I wanted to tell her everything in a single sentence, but the truth for a child has the teeth of nightmares, and I thought to spare her that. "You don't have to be everything to everyone," I mouthed, and the phrase felt both lie and instruction. Later, when I allowed myself a private second, I said to no one, "A ledger closed is a ledger healed," because I needed a line to hold on to. Anger is a ledger. It only balances when truth is recorded. Javier and I dug deeper into the server logs and found a session token that had been used from a machine located curiously behind the switch of the vendor Randy had thanked in his acceptance speech. The token showed a transfer window that matched the minute the presentation slid into the vendor portal and disappeared from public view. Vanessa made calls that moved like a series of falling dominoes: legal partners, an ethical auditor, a trusted reporter who had not yet picked a side. She insisted on formality. No leaks without legal strategy, no public posts without counsel. The difficulty was that the public sphere had already eaten our plan for breakfast. Screenshots and clipped audio had begun to circulate with captions that framed me alternately as liar and martyr depending on the political mood of whoever typed the comment. I felt the sharp sting of being reframed by people who had not seen the napkin or the midnight commits, people who judged on a 30-second loop. The hardest part was that truth, once revealed, must be carried by more than one witness. The internet's court, where views are the jury, often ignores the quiet witness of metadata. Vanessa crafted a motion that would force disclosure requests, subpoenas, an audit trail that would pull the technical veil off whoever thought they could stand behind charm. It was brutal theater in slow motion, and I began to recognize the shape of power. Not simply the muscular boastfulness of men like Randy, but the institutional inertia that protects them until proof insists otherwise. Randy's response was predictable in some ways and inventive in others. He called a quick press mini-conference and framed himself as victim of a smear campaign, and he had the coward's audience who preferred drama to nuance. He named my recent outbursts at the company as evidence of instability. He cited performance reviews in a way that read like a dossier of a man you could dismiss. That was the part that cut: the way ordinary papers and HR memos are wielded like weapons, the way a person's entire career can be graphically mapped and reduced under a few bullet points. I thought about the old pickup's dent and the small arithmetic of life bills, school fees, mortgage, and felt how fragile the scaffold of adulthood is when someone pulls a single bolt. Through the tension, I noticed a little thing: a barista I knew from Joe's Diner texting me a single word: proud. Small kindnesses matter. Emily, watching me, pressed her thumb to the world's best dad mug on the table and smiled with the kind of sad bravery that children learn early. It was a reminder that the fight was not only for me but to show her that wrongs can be righted without losing oneself. The night grew long as we compiled affidavits and logged hours. Every file we prepared had to be perfect, because perfection in court means you deprive your opponent of plausible deniability. Javier found an email thread where Sarah casually forwarded a snippet of my original commit with a line in the subject that read, "Take credit, easy win," and the screenshot replicated across a dozen feeds. The screenshot was a digital dagger. It cut through the fog and provoked a different kind of outrage. People love a villain whose mask slips. The board convened an emergency session that smelled of bad coffee and colder motives. They appointed an independent investigation and froze Randy's public-facing duties pending the results. The freeze was not a hung jury. It was a fracture. Randy's posture betrayed a man who had been certain he could steamroller everyone because power makes men believe they are entitled. That night I sat in the dark kitchen with the napkins spread on the table, the coffee ring moon staring up at me, and I thought of how humiliation had been a live wire through my life, and how sometimes humiliation becomes the coal that cooks the meal of retribution. I did not let myself celebrate. There was too much that could shift. Yet I allowed a small satisfaction, the luminous kind, the kind that arises when small facts align and the arrogant scaffolding starts to creak. I slept poorly, dreaming of fluorescent lights and the snap of evidence snapping shut like a jaw. The next day would demand more media calls, deposition prep, friends called to ask if I still trusted the company. But for the first time in weeks, the weight of uncertainty had a new angle, a tilt that suggested the possibility of writing. The world outside went on being indifferent and loud. Inside, the slow machine of procedure had started to grind in my favor, and I felt both relieved and hollowed because revenge is never the reclaiming of innocence. It is an exacting ledger that leaves you with accounts balanced but hands scarred. Revenge is never the reclaiming of innocence. It is an exacting ledger that leaves you with accounts balanced but hands scarred. And with that thought still raw in my chest, I slid my chair back from the kitchen table and began the part of the work that feels like digging hands in cold dirt. Precise, because you only get one chance to unearth something that will stand up under scrutiny. I moved through the next days like a man threading a needle with the tremor of sleep deprivation. Depositions scheduled, a lawyer's checklist with boxes that needed to be hammered in with signatures, a room at the downtown Hilton where Vanessa rehearsed the questions I would answer and the ones I would refuse. I ate diner eggs at noon and coffee that tasted like regret, and the napkin lay between the files like a small, patient relic. I spent an hour one morning in the gym, not because sweat undoes worry, but because the rhythm of the treadmill steadies the mind. In the locker room, I overheard two younger engineers comparing who had posted the most clever takedown meme the night before, their voices leaping between pride and cruelty. And it occurred to me that the modern courtroom is half law and half attention economy. One side needs evidence, the other needs a chorus. I let the chorus hum. I focused on the bolts. Javier spent long, late nights probing server logs, and once he found a pattern, he called it out with the excitement of a man who has spotted the shape of a solution in the static. There was a specific machine in the vendor network that had been used to upload the incriminating deck. The machine's MAC address traced not to an anonymous contractor, but to a white-label terminal in the vendor's conference room that Randy had used during his presentations. It was small, technical, the sort of thing anyone with a soldering iron and enough patience could understand, and that was the point: make the path of the theft so literal that it read like a map. We set a watch on it. We baited the path with decoy files containing markers only a forensic eye could see, a breadcrumb trail shorn of drama but heavy with meaning. Randy's arrogance was a live thing. He still believed he could run the play where rough men wave big hands and the rest of the world blinks. He took the bait. Late on a Friday, he logged a session from the vendor terminal that matched the exact time window when the deck had been moved. His user token was used to sign the transfer. That token had a twin, a time-stamped string and a chat message Sarah had sent a week earlier, flushed with laughter and an emoji that read, "Pull it, and I'll handle the spin." We captured screenshots, digital evidence that is at once mundane and lethal of the session, the token, and Sarah's text. The screenshots went into a folder labeled with the date like a war diary. I felt the pressure of having to remain calm. Every movement from me could be clipped out of context and weaponized, so I adopted a posture the lawyers loved, measured, minimal, immovable. But my chest was on fire and the flame wanted action. I timed things. We timed things. Vanessa insisted on the slow arc of subpoena and audit, because the law gives you small but inexorable tools, requests for metadata, demands for access logs, court orders that force a vendor to reveal who used a terminal at a given hour. It is not glamorous. It is the plumbing of justice, and I learned to love it for its relentlessness. The vendors' council pushed back. Randy took to his phone and began a campaign of soft public slanders through a small podcast network he'd befriended. He filed a complaint alleging harassment, and his people started to leak filtered parts of emails that framed me as unstable. I read those leaks with a kind of private exhaustion. I imagined his PR team as men with hairnets, packaging a story for sale. They misjudged one thing: the internet preserves what can be preserved, and people talk. A junior vendor texts someone with a slack jaw and a conscience that still twitch when you name it, forwarded an internal chat because he wanted to do the right thing and he knew a man could be ruined for sport. His message arrived at 3:12 a.m. to a secure inbox we had set up. It contained a raw audio clip of Randy leaving a voicemail for Sarah after a late dinner, the kind of message a man leaves when he thinks no one will hear it. Sharp laughter, a casual admission that we'll pin it as Michael's fault. He's never good with the stage. The clip was small and jagged, and when I listened I could hear the cadence of a man who believes he is above consequence. I felt a cold satisfaction and a sudden pity for the human heart that can utter such small cruelties as if they were jokes. We handled the audio with the same surgical care as the files. Verified chain of custody, hash checks, time-stamped logs. Vanessa reminded me that evidence is also about narrative. How you present it matters. So we built a chronology that left no space for the improvisations Randy loved. We placed the evidence so it would read in logical sequence, like a surgeon's notes. The tiny technicality, the vendor terminal, the token, Sarah's text, the voicemail formed a constellation. The more we aligned pieces, the more Randy's narrative began to look brittle. He swung back. He called an emergency all-hands meeting. He emailed the board with allegations about a smear, and he arranged a quick interview with a local station where he used the language of victimhood like a shield. I watched him on television with a hollow stomach, noticing how polished his teeth appeared under the lights, how practiced his indignation. Vanessa counseled silence in public. Every word out of my mouth could be curated to hurt me. She scheduled depositions and told me to keep to the facts, to let the machine unwind its way toward truth. And so I let the machine spin, even as I felt my patience fray into a wire. There were small, humiliating pressures between the big movements. A neighbor who pretended not to see me at the mailbox, an old client who stopped returning calls, a coach at the Little League who sent an apologetic message about conflicts of interest. Those were the peripheral cuts revenge does not tend to, but they mattered. Emily bore some of that, too. She fielded whispers in class and a passing cruelty from another parent, but she also held tighter to me in the car after practice and said, without drama, "Dad, are you okay?" And that small question steadied me more than any legal victory. There were moments I thought of giving up, of signing some bad paper and taking a lesser hurt. Then I imagined Randy smiling at the school recital, and I felt the wire tighten again. We prepared to push for a forensic audit that would pull logs from Randy's devices and the vendor's network. Vanessa drafted the request with clinical language. Javier prepared the forensic brief with the kind of obsessive patience he had once reserved for building circuits. We prepared depositions where witnesses would be required to testify about who had access to which files and when. The day before the audit, Randy took an unpredictable turn. He leaked an edited clip to a gossip site, portraying me as obsessive. My messages to colleagues portrayed as aggressive. My late-night commits framed as panicked attempts to hide something. The clip was cut like a weapon. Its aim was to delegitimize my temperament so that juries of public opinion would ignore the documents. The edited clip spread fast. I felt that sick old feeling of being watched and reduced to a caricature. Javier pushed back with a quiet fire. He dug into the editing metadata of the clip and found a trace and upload from a cloud account that had a recovery phone number linked to Randy's assistant. It was a small, almost laughable oversight. In his rage to strike, someone had kept the convenient handles close. We turned that trace into a question. Who had uploaded this clip, and why? The line between rash and reckless can be as thin as a forgotten two-factor authentication, and men like Randy typically forget that the architecture of their empire relies on unnoticed small things. Vanessa served notice, and the vendor found themselves with auditors breathing down the necks of their servers. We called witnesses. We subpoenaed access logs. The slow arithmetic of procedure began to accelerate. Vendor cooperation produced IP logs that matched the session tokens we had flagged. The voicemail showed corroboration in call logs. Sarah's chat messages, once dismissed as flippant, were read in a deposition aloud and bore the weight of intent. The procedural justice I had wanted arrived not as a flash but as a grind-consistent, brutal, unromantic. At one deposition, Randy tried to pivot. He argued that the vendor's logs were corrupt, that the evidence chain was tampered with, that we were playing a dirty game. He looked at me across the table and said, "You would believe anything that makes you feel like a martyr." His attempt at moral calculus was naked and small. Vanessa stood and asked for the phone call logs that would either support or refute his claim. Randy's face flushed. His counsel advised silence. Someone muttered about legal peril. The audit team asked the vendor to run an image of the terminal. The terminal's system logs, for once, were ruthlessly thorough, and they recorded the user token and every mouse click in a way that could not be undone. It was procedural justice in its purest sense, the cold, bureaucratic snapping of a trap that relies on the enemy's disregard for form. We gathered the evidence like stones for a mosaic, and the image they made was unmistakable. The company's chair Collins began to see that this was no internecine spat but a legal morass. He convened emergency counsel and asked the very question that changes the tenor of meetings. "Can we defend this?" The board answered with silence. Randy went from defiant to defensive in the span of a week. The PR channels dried up. Favors that had once been easy to call in suddenly required invoices. I watched this with a complicated satisfaction because what I wanted was not simply theatrical humiliation, but the dismantling of the systems that allowed men like Randy to believe they were invincible. There was one more thing to do before the evidence was made public. One final procedural hinge. A clause in the IP assignment that required a notary signature for any transfer of inventor rights under specific value thresholds. An old quirk of the company charter, written by a cautious founder who liked red tape. No one had noticed because the clause was invisible to men who assume paperwork is a formality. But Randy's transfer had lacked that notarization. We prepared the motion to challenge the validity of his claim on that basis. It was technical, dull, devastating. If he had not followed the form, then the transfer was void and the designation of authorship could not stand. I felt the pulse in my hand. The trap was not a roar but a small, legal mousetrap, and it would snap with the same quiet mortality as any machine when the right bolt is removed. I spoke to Emily that night in a voice stripped of all theater and told her, "We keep doing the small, honest things because sometimes that is the only honest thing left." It was not a line for the cameras. It was my attempt to anchor her in the work we were doing so she would see that justice is often built out of tedious, careful labor. I went to bed with the napkin under my pillow and woke dreaming of spreadsheets and server logs. The dream was neither poetic nor restful, but it had the clarity of a man whose mind is fixed on a single plane. The next day, we would file the motion, and I knew that the motion itself was not the end. It was a hinge that would allow an auditor to open a door into what men like Randy kept hidden. I felt the trap tighten and the city moving around me like an indifferent audience. The work was surgical now, and the distance between truth and victory had contracted to a few signatures, a few verified hashes, a few honest testimonies, and one last risky outreach to a journalist who had not yet taken a side. I sent the journalist a folder with the timeline and waited for the small sound that comes before a public unraveling. The intake of breath that happens when the first reporter realizes the whole story is bigger than a meme. And I sat with that intake in my chest like a man bracing for impact, knowing that when the world tilted, it would tilt hard, and I would need every file, every witness, every small, honest thing to hold it steady. And I sat with that intake in my chest like a man bracing for impact, knowing that when the world tilted, it would tilt hard, and I would need every file, every witness, every small, honest thing to hold it steady. The next morning, the newsroom called like a wake-up bell. The journalist I'd sent the folder to, Leah Park, who smelled faintly of peppermint and had a notebook habit that made her look like a collector, met me in a glassed cafe and said 3 words and no more. "We're running." We had planned for the journalist to pull the thread at a specific hour when the board was least likely to control the narrative. Leah's piece dropped with the precise, surgical impact of a guillotine. It began with the napkin image, scanned and magnified until the coffee ring looked like a crater, and then it laid the chain bare. The timestamp commits traced to my account. The scanned napkin's hash anchored to an immutable timestamp I had arranged months before when I first sketched the idea, an untidy, stubbornly practical thing. I had not been naive. I had uploaded a high-resolution scan to a trusted timestamp service and then emailed the hash to 3 separate addresses with PGP signatures so that if anyone tried to say the napkin was forged, there would be a public record that proved otherwise. That secret, the small, technical paranoia that had felt like an eccentricity when I did it, was the quiet advantage I had been carrying like a spare key. The reporter explained it plainly. A signed hash is a way to say, in effect, this existed at this time, and you can't argue with the math. Leah walked readers through an evidence map. Commit hashes, vendor terminal logs, Sarah's text messages, Randy's voicemail, and the notarization clause in the IP assignment that Randy had neglected. The piece ran with a headline that treated the company like a set of cards someone had carelessly shuffled. Beneath it, the napkin's coffee ring glittered like an accusation. Social feeds went from smirks to scrutiny to a roar that can only be described as fury dressed as fascination. Within hours, the story was everywhere, an explicable thread, a viral clip of Randy's earlier accusation juxtaposed with the scanned napkin image, and the thread of lawyers parsing exactly what the lack of notarization meant for Randy's claim. The vendor's PR misfired. They issued a bland statement that only made people angrier, because it read like the practiced evasion of a company with something to hide. The board convened with a speed that suggested they now knew the cost of being on the wrong side of a story that looked like theft. The day the audit results were presented, the boardroom felt like a courtroom. Collins, who used to tap his pen in private, was now visibly unnerved as Vanessa laid out the motion. The transfer of rights was void because Randy had not followed the charter's notary requirement. The vendor logs tied the session token to a terminal he had used, and the time-stamped napkin proved origin. The legal phrasing was dry and exact, but by the time Vanessa framed it in the room's light, nobody could pretend ignorance. Randy's face had the slick pallor of a man who suddenly understood that his posture would not shield him from the arithmetic of paperwork. He tried to speak, to call it an orchestrated smear, but the room listened only to the documents on the screen and to Leah Park's piece now running in the background on phones. Sarah's earlier bravado collapsed into a quiet, sharp defensiveness that did her no favors. Her counsel advised her not to speak. People in the room who had nodded with Randy's jokes before now shifted uncomfortably. because corporate loyalty bends with the weather of risk. The procedural hinge we had found, the missing notarization, was not flashy, but it was absolute. Without the proper form, his transfer was void and the claim of authorship could not stand. Vanessa put it plainly. The company had to rescind any claim Randy had made based on the transfer, and pending litigation would determine damages. Collins asked if they should suspend Randy immediately. The pause that followed held the answer. The board voted. The room's air seemed to contract as the clerk read the outcome aloud. Randy Whitaker, whose voice had once filled rooms and bank accounts, was suspended pending further action and ordered to surrender his company devices for forensic imaging. He paled like a man who had only ever handled trophies but never a receipt. The social media tides turned into an accusation that smelled of consequence. Memes burned out quickly and were replaced by op-eds and legal deep dives, and Randy's name became a case study in hubris. But procedural justice was only half the work. The public needed to see the symbolism of accountability. Leah's story had the napkin and the hashes, but people wanted a moment, a picture that made the abstract feel visceral. We arranged for the evidence to be presented in a public hearing where Leah could stream the details. I walked into that room carrying the original Joe's Diner napkin and a clear evidence bag like a relic wrapped in proof. It felt absurd yet honest. There it was, a grease-stained fragment of the night I stayed late, scribbling an idea on a napkin over eggs. In the hearing room, I placed it on the table so every camera could see the coffee ring circle like a moon. Randy watched through the glass while Vanessa introduced the image and the time-stamped anchor that proved its existence before anyone could have exclaimed ownership. When the napkin was displayed, the cameras caught a flash across Randy's face that was almost animal surprise. Then fury, then the slow slick of panic. Someone in the crowd, an ex-employee who had been quietly watching the company's culture, stood up and announced he had evidence of similar thefts. That person's statement became the breadcrumb that led investigators to interviews that widened the scope of the inquiry beyond a single theft into a pattern of opportunism. The vendors' lawyers found themselves facing subpoenas. Their resistance collapsed under the weight of forensic imaging that matched session tokens to devices, and internal emails showed a pattern of laundering credit through vendor portals to make it seem as if Randy had invented things he had only curated. The pattern is often dull until it is not. Once you can see how small, repeated choices aggregate into theft, the moral pattern becomes a fact. Randy's PR attempts to frame himself as a scapegoat read as contrived. His friends in the industry dropped polite calls to his counsel like stones in a pond. The company's chair had to take defensive steps to stabilize stock and placate clients, and in the chaos, a regulator expressed interest. These were not theatrical punishments, but institutional consequences that hurt in places that mattered: reputation, access, and income. And the digital world did its part. Leah's timeline of evidence was shared and reshared until people who had no reason to care about trade secrets understood the basic unfairness. A man had been humiliated at a banquet, and the man who humiliated him had stolen the thing he coveted. Public sympathy gathered like rain clouds. Randy's award committee rescinded its recognition and pulled back his scheduled keynote. Sponsors distanced themselves. One of his largest clients paused contracts pending review. The practical mathematics of consequence did what drama could not. It removed the scaffolding that had allowed Randy to pretend he was indispensable. I felt a vindication so clean it almost frightened me. The kind of clarity that leaves little room for triumph because it insists on the exactness of facts rather than the romance of revenge. But I had not sought merely to break him. The aim had been to make the system demand its own repair. The vendor made restitution offers and then found themselves facing regulatory probes that would require paybacks and reforms. Randy's personal cascade was messy and public. A range of professional penalties and a civil suit that would bleed his assets if the court concurred. He had once stood above the law in his mind. Now he lived within it, like the rest of us, with dates and signed documents that meant something. The symbolic victory, the napkin appearing under the lights, was not only about spectacle. It was about showing Emily and other people who had been shrugged off that the small, honest things we keep can matter. After the hearing, Emily hugged me in the hallway while cameras angled for a shot. She smelled like mint gum and felt both proud and bewildered, and for a second I let her see the exhaustion behind my face. Vanessa advised restraint. Legal fights continued and would for months. But the critical hinge had swung and procedural justice had bared its teeth. In private, when the adrenaline ebbed, I thought about the cost. Friendships frayed, a career scarred, reputation tamped down by months of being cast alternately as villain and victim. There were nights the old fear came back, the fear of losing stability for Emily and of being remembered only as a man who fought rather than one who had built. Yet the work had taught me a lesson I could now state without flourish. One must preserve the small, honest records because arrogance erodes memory. My one simple line of wisdom I whispered to myself then and still held as truth. Justice is a slow machine that only hums when you feed it truth. The months after the hearing were procedural and ugly. Randy's counsel combed through our artifacts, looking for anything to discredit the chain of custody, scrambling to find procedural missteps that could reopen the case. But every file had been hashed, every chain accounted for, every envelope had been couriered and witnessed. We had performed the small, boring religious rites of evidence, gathering until they became unassailable. When the civil suit was filed, I sat in the gallery while Vanessa and Randy's counsel sparred over motions that read like a language I had learned by living. The judge's voice was steady and oddly humane, and when he asked to see the original napkin evidence, I watched Randy's face crumple in a way no camera could stage. The judge noted the lack of notarization on the transfer and the vendor logs that placed Randy in the sequence of illicit transfers. The decision to grant an injunction that froze Randy's decisions and required review felt like a legal fulcrum that would tilt more than just one man. In a separate motion, the vendor agreed to an independent audit and admitted procedural lapses in handling intellectual property assignments. They accepted fines and a compliance review. The slow machinery of the law closed in, and it was neither glorious nor vindictive. It was methodical, which suited me because I had never wanted spectacular cruelty. I wanted the right thing to be enforced. The public fallout left Randy with fewer allies. His attempts at social sympathy met only skepticism because the math of evidence had concluded a story that honesty had started. In the aftermath, I returned to Joe's diner on a rainy evening, the neon sign reflecting in puddles like a modest stage light, and I ate eggs beneath the hum of the same radio where the napkin had first been born. I took the napkin out of its evidence bag, and, in a small ceremony that felt like closing a book, I set it down on the table where I had once scribbled and said quietly to myself and to the quiet world, "This is what we do, keep receipts." Emily was there with me, sticky-fingered and solemn, and she laughed once like a sound I had missed. And in that laugh I felt the exhaustion lift a little. The company began to rebuild its policies. The board instituted stricter notarization practices and vendor controls, and Vanessa, who had been calm through the storm, sent me a single message: "You did the work." The courts would handle the rest, and the months to come would involve depositions, motions, and the blunt arithmetic of settlements. I would never be exactly the man I had been. There were new lines in my face and new care in my step, but I had given Emily a demonstration that small, honest actions could beat theatrical lies. The napkin, the time stamp, the vendor logs, and the notarization clause had done what shouting could not. They removed the scaffolding of entitlement and required accountability. I walked away from the courthouse with my hands in my pockets, a little hollowed and steadier, the city noise folding around me like a familiar jacket, and I said nothing to the cameras because words can be trimmed and used. Instead, I let the thin, true record of what I'd kept, paper, cryptographic hashes, witness statements speak with the authority of facts. The life lesson I carried home was plain and American. Keep your records, and don't let a man's loudness substitute for proof. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.